Yeah, good morning, everybody. Welcome to quite a sunny Friday up in Sheffield. This is one of our regular members' education sessions. Many of you will have been to some of them before. I'm Chris Carrigan. I'm a data advisor for Use My Data, and I'm part of the Use My Data Secretariat, and we organise these on your behalf. We put these on roughly once every 3 weeks. There was a bit of hiatus of a couple of months ago, but it's usually every 3 weeks on a single theme. And those themes all come from members or something that's been in the media or something which is topical. And the format for today is going to follow the usual format for those who have been before, which is around 20 minutes to hear about a particular topic, and the rest of the time for discussion, Q&A, anything you want to ask, anything you want to hear. If you do want to ask a question, please keep it short and focused so we can get to as many as possible, because the hour goes really quickly. And a final reminder, we don't all have to agree on the same things. Part of the really good thing about Use My Data, we've got a range of opinions, and having that sort of disagreement is really good. And we need to hear all those perspectives. So it's important that we all have respect for the views of others. You can disagree, but don't be disagreeable, I would say. Okay, enough from me. Let's get started. So today's session is the second of two from our friends at Genomics England, addressing the transformative potential of genomics in healthcare. This session will look at how genomic data is going to be used for research, the consent process, data protection mechanisms, and other things as well. And the team will talk you through that. If you want to go back and watch the first session, the link will be in the newsletter if it's not already. So with that, I shall pass on. So I think Anne-Marie, I shall pass on to you. Perhaps you could introduce yourselves and say who the rest of the team are, and then the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. We're delighted to be here again today. My name's Anne-Marie Hamilton. I'm the Director of Engagement and Public Partnerships at Genomics England. And it's really great to recognise some of you from the first session that we ran, and to see Kerry as well, who was at our recent research summit in London. So in our first session with you, we talked about what is genomics, who are Genomics England, and we talked about some of our areas of focus as a company and the role that genomics is playing in NHS critical care delivery. And we started to explore some of the ethical issues around privacy, data use and consent. And so today I'm joined by Alex Renzihausen, who's the Head of Science and Clinical Office at Genomics England, Natalie Banner, who's the Director of Ethics at Genomics England, and Helen White, who's the Vice Chair for Cancer for the participant panel. And we are really pleased to be able to talk to you today about the role of genomics in enabling research, and how Genomics England facilitates that through the National Genomic Research Library. So our plan for the session, Alex has some slides that he's going to share, is to give you a quick recap on what we mean by genomics and Genomics England. And then for Helen to really talk through the participant perspective when considering whether or not to share genomic data, and the critical role that the participant panel play in decision making within Genomics England and its different committees, particularly around access to data. Natalie's going to talk through some of those ethical issues around trust, consent and transparency. And then Alex is going to explain how Genomics England manages access to the genomic data that we hold in the National Genomic Research Library, or NGRL for short. So we're going to try and talk that through, as Chris said, in 25 minutes or so, to allow plenty of time for question and discussion at the end. We really enjoyed the discussion we had with you last time, so we're looking forward to some great questions again this time. So I'll hand over to Alex to take you through the first section.
But yeah, as Anne-Marie already introduced the agenda, so here it is again quickly. We'll obviously also share all the slides after the meeting today. But yeah, if there's any bits along the way that you want to sort of have clarified, please do stop us along the way as well. So we covered this in session one a little bit. So just this concept of what is genomics, and I'm just going to fly over this just in case you hadn't had a chance to watch the session one recording, or you weren't there in person. So just very briefly, genomics is a study of all of the set of organisms or persons' genes, and how these genes interact with each other and with the environment. And genes are really made up of this sort of genetic code, or DNA. And you see a sort of image here on your screen of this sort of typical representation of a DNA strand with these so this 4-letter code, A, T, C's, and G's. And this is really the blueprint for how your cells function, how you as an organism are built and set up, and how you function as well. And generally speaking, the changes in this genetic code or DNA can happen all the time, and generally speaking, harmless and often also quite useful. But there can be instances where changes in the DNA code have some sort of effect downstream, where they then affect the way that your cells function, or that a certain protein or element of your cells sort of operate or function. And that could then potentially have harmful effects. And when there are harmful effects, that's when there might be a condition or a disease as a result of this genetic change. And it's really to understand these genetic changes that you need quite large data and clinical insights and research to really understand whether a change actually has an impact on a certain condition. And there's three types of basically methods that you can use to analyze or get this whole genomic sequencing data. There's target sequencing, which is or panel sequencing, which looks at specific areas of the genome. There's whole exome sequencing that looks at just the coding regions within your genome, so those regions that code for proteins. And then there's whole genome sequencing, which looks at the entirety of your genetic code, and that really gives you a lot of information. And it's this whole genome sequencing that we at GEL predominantly focus on. And just to introduce Genomics England again briefly, and particularly the National Genomic Research Library, I'll just go through a couple of slides here. So our vision at Genomics England is a world where everyone benefits from genomic healthcare. And we see ourselves really as enablers to achieving this vision and working with others to achieve this vision. And that is both across healthcare. So we focus on sort of working with the NHS and partners in the healthcare setting to evolve genomic healthcare, particularly the use of whole genome sequencing in a healthcare setting for patient benefit, but also accelerating genomic research and really using the data and the insights that are generated on the healthcare side to really fuel new discoveries and therapeutic developments also on the research side. So you really have this cycle where data, knowledge, insights are shared between healthcare and research. And when we talk about bringing the benefit of genomics to patients, it's really focusing on three main areas in the healthcare setting. So that's improving diagnosis, so using DNA or genomic data for diagnostic purposes, but also looking at newer technologies to capture that information that could be used in a healthcare setting. It's also about helping clinicians select the most effective treatments, and also patients and understanding those treatments in a better way, again, using genomic data. And genomic data can also be used to look at whether patients might be eligible for clinical trials. So that's another important use case of genomic data in the healthcare setting. And on the research side, it's really all about the sort of National Genomic Research Library for us. It's about sort of data, samples, both clinical data, whole genome sequencing data, and other sort of omic or research-related data sets flowing into this secure database and bioresource that is managed by Genomics England in partnership with the NHS. And yeah, this holds all these sort of data and the samples that are provided by participants of Genomics England's research programs and also the NHS Genomic Medicine Service. And so it's that sort of accumulation of samples and data that we call the National Genomic Research Library, or the NGRL. And just wanted to give you a brief glimpse at sort of the different programs that contribute to the growth or contribute data to the National Genomic Research Library. And that's the 100,000 Genomes program, which we covered a little bit in the first session, which was really the program run by Genomics England and the NHS to generate the evidence for whole genome sequencing to be beneficial in both healthcare and translational research. Obviously, also the NHS Genomic Medicine Service, where the Genomic Medicine Service provides a whole range of genomic tests within the NHS, and we've partnered with them to deliver particularly whole genome sequencing as standard of care, again, to enable more stratified medicine and personalized care, but also for that data then to be used for research purposes. We've got a cancer program which looks at different sort of newer technologies and different data sets that could be useful in cancer treatment and research. We also run a cohorts program. This is where we partner with academics or life sciences industry partners to generate data sets on in sort of specific indications or disease areas, so that this data can then again be used in the National Genomic Research Library for research. We've also run a COVID-19 program. We've got our generation study, which is our newborn sequencing program that looks at detecting and treating childhood onset rare conditions much earlier, again, delivered in partnership with the NHS. And our diverse data program, which is also generating data on more ethnically diverse groups so that this data can be used in research. And finally, on this slide, there's a rare disease omics pilot, which is a little bit a step, also a step forward from just using whole genome and clinical data. This looks at also generating data on RNA, so transcriptomic data, also data on proteins, proteomic data, and metabolomic data, which is essentially sort of chemical signature data from samples from some of these programs that I've just talked about. And having these different data sets and linking them together, again, will help sort of research, particularly for identifying new diagnostic changes in the DNA that can then again be translated into practice. And with that, I'll hand over to Helen to tell you a bit more about sharing data for research and our participant panel.
Thank you, Alex. So why do people decide to share their data for research in the National Genomic Research Library, the NGRL? Alex, the slide's not moved on my view. Thank you very much. What motivates them? I mean, clearly it's a very personal decision, but I just wanted to give you 3 examples that I guess I have sort of some experience of myself or talking to colleagues. So if you're diagnosed with cancer and you get a chance to join a research project like the 100,000 Genome Project, most people in my experience are pretty open to sharing their data. Certainly for me, I was diagnosed with endometrial or womb cancer. This was a really easy decision for me when I was offered this. I was told that joining the project wouldn't impact my own treatment, but it felt like a really positive thing to be doing during what was quite a scary time. It felt that it just gave me hope that my data could make a difference for others in the future. If, however, you're a parent with a child who has multiple unexplained symptoms, like some of my colleagues on the panel, and you've been through months or even years of tests, scans, GP hospital visits, admissions, joining the 100,000 Genomes Projects offered a lot of hope for them. Hope for finding a diagnosis that could end that long search for answers, hope for discovering ways to treat or manage your child's condition. Getting a diagnosis might also help you connect with others who truly understand what you're going through and give you a chance to build a community and to advocate together for more research and treatments. And finally, as you've heard from Alex just now, if you're a parent expecting a baby, you might be given the option, go sort of now and going forwards, depending which hospital you're at, to join the generation study. And this is looking at the feasibility of whole genome sequencing for detecting rare treatable genetic conditions in newborns. And finding these conditions early means that families can get the care and the treatment much sooner, which clearly leads to better outcomes. So, in this case, parents may well be motivated to share their baby's data because they want to find out if their baby has any of the conditions being screened for as part of the study. So on to the participant panel. We've mentioned it a little bit, but just to give you an outline of what that is and what it does. What exactly does it do when it comes to Genomics England and its partners' use of participant data? So the panel's made up of around 25 volunteers who have first-hand experience with a rare condition or cancer, and we've all agreed to share our own data or our loved ones' data in the NGRL. Our role is to speak up for everyone whose data is held in the NGRL, and we give advice to the Genomics England board and the senior leadership about what it's really like to live with or be diagnosed with these conditions and what matters to us and our communities that we represent. And we really do help shape decisions about how Genomics England uses our data, who can access it. And that really helps to ensure that participants' and patients' interests are always at the centre of those decisions. As Alex mentioned earlier, we're also actively involved in decision-making on several committees. The Access Review Committee, I'm on that one. That reviews applications from researchers who want to access participant data in the NGRL. We've also got members on the Ethics Advisory Committee. This provides independent advice and oversight on ethical issues related to Genomics England's activities and the wider field of genomics. And we've also got members on the Research Network Committee, which oversees the work of the communities of academic researchers who have access to participant data. We also are, as a panel, are very keen to promote public and patient and participant involvement and engagement in Genomics England in the research activities. And I've just got a few examples that I can share with you. So we have been involved in highlighting different ways to engage the participant and patient communities. For example, one of our members helped to organise a webinar for the sight loss community. And if you're interested about that, there's more information about that in an article that we have published. I think hopefully the details of that will be at the end of this presentation. We've also worked to create a language guide to help anyone working in genomics or healthcare communicate more effectively with participants and patients. That was based on our own experience of not always being quite as effective as we'd like it to be. And it's so important to have that trust relationship between researchers and patients and participants. Again, hopefully details will be at the end. We've set up a communications working group, which is made up of both panel members and Genomics England staff. And this is really focused on looking at ways to spread the word about the benefits of using participant data for research, like publicising diagnostic discoveries, sharing participant stories, making sure information is accessible to everyone. We've also been actively involved in some of Genomics England's academic research groups. I, for example, have been closely involved with the endometrial cancer group for several years now. But right now, the challenge for my colleagues who serve on the Research Network Committee is figuring out how to engage and involve participants and patients in the 8 new research communities. I think Alex is going to come on to those later on, that make up the Research Network, and this is certainly work in progress. Finally, we're always looking to make the most of opportunities to talk about and promote participant involvement within the panel itself, and also participant and patient involvement in genomics research. Today is a perfect example of this, and thanks very much for inviting me to take part. I think I'm due to hand over to Natalie, but I also see a hand up. Do you want me to take that?
Oh, Francesca, perhaps if you pose your question, then Helen or others can decide whether to take it now or whether it's easier to do it later. Francesca?
Thank you. Because Helen was talking about data, I just wanted one quick answer. Who is Genomics England both the data processor, yeah, and controller? Because, you know, something that came about last year, not only with Genomics England, but also Our Future Health, was the use of e-consenting, okay? And there is standardization around a 2-stage consenting process, but I raised this up with the HRA about how do we ensure the integrity of mental capacity, people that may have deprivation of liberty safeguard standard, because you're not having those discussions person to person. So, whether, you know, categories of special categories are somehow embedded within Genomics England. If they're both the controller and the processor, then I think that's okay. And I think what you say, Helen, you know, about representing the public, well, it's all very well having a committee, but if you don't actually give an opportunity to elicit people's narratives and perspectives to bring into discussion, how is that taken forward, you know, representing the views, unless it's a closed membership of your 100,000. That's the bit I don't know. Thank you.
I'm Francesca.
I
don't know whether you want to pick that up now or as you're going through the slides, whichever's easier for you guys.
I suggest maybe, because Natalie is going to talk a little bit, touch on some of these points as well. So I suggest that we take that as the question after the presentation, if that's all right, Francesca.
Sure, there are lots of questions in there, Francesca. On the data controller processor question, I can answer that for when participants consent to participating in the NGRL, then Genomics England is the data controller for that data. And when working with NHS England, so for example, through the Genomic Medicine Service, we are a data processor on behalf of Genomics England. So there is some complexity there, but for participants who've consented to the NGRL, Genomics England is the controller, and we can definitely come to that question about bringing on board different perspectives and so on into decision-making processes, perhaps in the conversation as part of the question. So thank you for that. So I'm going to speak a little bit about consent, trust, and transparency, which may address some of the questions you're raising, Francesco. Helen mentioned trust. This is a really, really important framing for us. We are very conscious of the fact that we do have a consent process that participants do consent to be part of our National Genomic Research Library, but that's not enough. You know, we don't think of consent as being, well, we've got participant consent and therefore, you know, essentially we have carte blanche. Trust and transparency are really, really critically important to us. And actually, you know, what we try to do around demonstrating those elements of what it means to be a trustworthy organization are absolutely open to challenge. Are we doing enough? Are we doing enough to be open and honest about the way that we work, about how decisions are made? And we're constantly looking to try and iterate and improve on that. You know, for a start, we need to be able to demonstrate reliability and competence, a track record in managing and using data safely and effectively. We need to show good governance and accountability, who's making decisions and how, whose head's on the block if it goes wrong. Usually that'll be mine. Show that we can be transparent, provide the right level of information. And that's a really tricky one for us because there is a huge level of complexity to how data is managed, what data flows where, and so on. So how do we get the right balance of providing accurate information to potential participants without overwhelming and overloading and creating more sort of question and challenge, particularly, as Helen said, the point at which you may be consenting to participate may be a very stressful time of your life, and we don't want to kind of create more anxiety and distress with too much technical detail. So for us, it's a constant question about how we provide the right level of information that enable people to feel confident to make an informed decision, recognizing that there's also a lot of complexity underpinning all this. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit about our consent process. Alex will come on to discuss a little bit more detail about the National Genomic Research Library and the types of research that happen in practice. But I'm going to take this this lens from how we go through the consenting process and what it is we actually convey to participants in the materials we have. Everything that we do at Genomics England in terms of the use of data aims to be in line with the expectations we set and manage with our participants. The participant panel is an incredibly valuable sounding board for that, but of course it cannot represent everyone. We have a consent process that is regulated by a research ethics committee approved by the Health Research Authority, but we also have lots of collateral information around that process. So we have infographics, animations, information sheets, and so on. Essentially, when you participate in the NGRL, whether you're coming to us through the Genomic Medicine Service and receiving a clinical genomic test, or you're part of a research cohort, essentially there are multiple front doors into the Genomic Research Library, but the way that we handle and manage data within that library is the same, whatever door you come through, as it were. So when we get consent from participants to manage and use their data for the long term, we de-identify that data within the environment, but we make sure we're clear that actually that consent is quite broad. So you may consent to having a genomic test and to participating in the NGRL because, as Helen it gave the example of, you may have a cancer that for which a whole genome sequence is suitable as a test, but the research purposes that data could be used for could be multiple. There could be research on that particular cancer or that particular condition, but there could also be research on a number of other things as well. So the consent is deliberately broad, and it's also technology agnostic. So we don't specify we will use next generation sequencing only because there are lots and lots of new technologies being developed. Alex mentioned different types of omics research, RNA sequencing. There's new technologies around sequencing longer chunks of DNA that could detect more complex variation than traditional sequencing methods. So we don't specify in the consent what types of technologies will be used to analyze that data. And that's very deliberate because the technology is evolving all the time. So when you consent to participate in the NGRL, there is information materials and videos and so on you can watch, and always somebody that you can ask questions of as well. It will usually be taken by a clinician, and there's lots of sort of training and education materials through Health Education England for clinicians about the typical questions people might ask, and sort of explain the use of the NGRL for those broader, longer term research purposes. As I mentioned, we are governed by a Research Ethics Committee approval, and that approval essentially allows Genomics England to set up a governance framework that permits researchers to come into the library and use that data for lots of different purposes without in every individual case having to go through an additional Research Ethics Committee, because it's a resource. We have this resource there to be used for multiple purposes. And the REC approval has, you know, we have in that governance framework, we've set out what those permitted uses are. And you'll see on this slide, there's a lot of broad acceptable uses, because we want to promote the idea of using genomic and clinical data for innovative research and for lots of different kind of public and social benefit purposes. But we're also very clear that we prohibit certain things. So we would never allow access to the data by insurance or marketing companies or for insurance or marketing purposes. We would not allow police access for forensic purposes. We would not allow linkage to employment tax benefits records. We would not allow paternity testing. So there are purposes that we very specifically draw red lines around. Other research institutes and infrastructures may have different red lines, but for us, we feel these are the right ones to ensure that our participants can have confidence that even though we're allowing their data to be used for quite a broad range of scientific purposes, they're all in line with their expectations and the sorts of things they would want to see their data being used for. And Alex will give some more examples in a moment about the types of research. So we've talked about the NGRL as being this kind of library of participant data, and it's really important to understand that in addition to the genomic data, we have ongoing clinical records. So the genomic data in and of itself is really interesting and helpful, but it's really valuable and useful when you can connect it to ongoing clinical records, because you can see how people are doing. You can see how their diagnostic pathway changes. You can see their prognosis. You can see how a condition may affect them over the longer term, what medications they're taking, and so on. So while we collect that clinical, that genomic data in that first instance, we also have that connection to ongoing clinical records. So this is really a long-term, participation in the library. And then the research environment is essentially the interface into that library for our researchers. It's the way that researchers can access the data, which is held in a de-identified form, and they can use that for research purposes. Now, one critical feature of this library is that it is de-identified, as I say. Next slide, please, Alex. It is de-identified, so you cannot tell who individuals are within that environment. However, a really important part of our model is that if a researcher does discover something that could, for example, be a new diagnosis for a patient participant who's been, desperately waiting for some understanding and some insight, we within Genomics England have the ability to re-identify that participant and make that information available to their clinician. So it's not entirely separate from the clinical service. It is possible for us internally to say, we think there's a new diagnosis for this individual, and we can feed that back. And there's over 2,000 of those diagnostic discoveries, as we call them, that have actually gone back to the NHS in the past couple of years. I also want to mention the airlock, which is essentially this idea that the data that is held within that environment has to stay in the environment. But of course, you'll only get progress in scientific research if you're able to publish insights and findings. So we do have a process for extracting summary and analysis data from that environment. So once a researcher has done their analysis, they may have found some new connection between a genetic variant and a particular kind of symptom. They want to be able to publish that data to show that advance in scientific understanding. And we have a committee that's dedicated to making decisions about what data can be extracted from that environment to ensure that it's not identifiable and that there could be no possibility of a participant being identified from the summary statistics that are extracted through that airlock process. So that's that kind of overview of our sort of processes, and Alex will now go into a bit more detail about how you actually, from a researcher perspective, access that library and the sorts of things that researchers do in practice. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So Natalie's covered this a fair bit. I'm just putting this slide up. I'm sure probably this group will be quite familiar with the 5 safes framework around which sort of many trusted research environments are built, including our research environment through which researchers can access the National Genomic Research Library. But we always use this sort of type of analogy of sort of an aquarium, or I use that analogy because I quite like it. So you go into an aquarium, you sort of look at the fish, you can look at different patterns of the fish, learn about the fish, but you wouldn't take a fish home, right? Because that's sort of frowned upon. So it's the same concept here with a trusted research environment that we run, where researchers come in, they can do their research, run their analyses, look at the data, but they wouldn't take any data out. And that's a sort of airlock process that Natalie has also spoken about that really ensures that this is maintained. And I just wanted to, this is a bit of a busy slide, but I'll talk you through this because it's just the process for how academic and life science industry partners work with data in the National Genomic Research Library, and just highlight sort of where the 5 safes come in. So in terms of safe projects, researchers submit project proposals to both Genomics England and an independent access review committee. Those projects are reviewed, as well as the researchers themselves are vetted. And we also look at the institutions that they're based at or employed by. And once approved by this committee and internal Genomics England team, approved projects are then also publicly viewable on our website on this research registry. And once we share this slide deck, that link is also clickable, so you can look at the projects that are in there. There's over 1,000 projects that have been registered to date. And within approved projects, the researchers then go into a sort of onboarding process where part of that is also that they have to complete information governance training. And following that information governance training and this onboarding process, they're given credentials to then access the research environment. And in that environment, which is of course a safe setting, they have access to de-identified data, so safe data from participants who consented for this data to be available in the environment. And they also have access to very sort of pre-processed and annotated data sets. So that's quite useful because it's not just raw data. There's also sort of data that already has had some analysis done to it, which expedites the research process. And they also have access to many different tools and workflows as well, which again helps researchers to conduct their research. And then, as Natalie said, once a researcher wants to export a file, be that sort of potentially a figure that they've created, or some sort of summary statistics, these are then checked by our airlock team and the airlock committee to ensure that whatever leaves the environment is in line with participants' consent, is also in line with the approved project that researchers were given access to the environment with in the first place, and checks against various other criteria and airlock rules as well. And of course, all this process together then leads to new insights, various publications, diagnostic discoveries, and also new treatments and therapies being developed. And as Helen mentioned, we've recently launched a new research network, and we've built this network around 8 cross-cutting research communities. And really the idea is for Genomics England to support researchers in working across different disease areas, different indications and different types of research and research methodology to be able to collaborate better and really generate impactful research insights. And so we've got communities here, I'm not going to go through all of them, but for example, looking at pan-cancer and molecular oncology, so looking across different cancer types. Also bioinformatics and machine learning, so actually looking more at methodologies around analyzing genomic data. And also sort of population genomics, which become very interesting now with the newborn screening program, for example, where there's population level genomic data that will be entering the research environment. And aside from getting access to the research environment and so the data that's so securely held within it, and also becoming part of this community of researchers, researchers also get access to quite a lot of support from Genomics England. That includes different guides for them to access the data and analyze the data in different ways. We also run live training sessions, which showcase the different range of applications that are available to researchers in the research environment. And importantly, they also get access to pre-built workflows, because oftentimes, particularly in bioinformatic research, there are elements of the research process which are similar across different projects. And actually having these pre-built workflows really speeds up research and makes it a lot easier for researchers to also get acquainted with the research environment and use the data to the maximum benefit. And I just wanted to sort of finish on touching on a few different use cases and give you some examples of the type of research that has happened within the on data in the National Genomic Research Library through the research environment. So this one, and they're quite heavy slides. I intentionally kept quite a lot of text on there so you can read a bit more about them once we share the slide deck. I'm just going to fly through them though. So this one's a bit more of an academic, so basic research use case. So this group looked at over 66,000 genomes from participants that have consented for their data to be held in the NGRL. And it found that sort of in mitochondria, so these are the energy producing parts of your cells, they found that DNA of those mitochondria is sort of has its own sort of type of evolution and acts it does some interesting things that potentially are quite relevant in cancer and also in other diseases. So this is quite a basic fundamental understanding around these sort of mitochondria and how your cells function that was derived from work on NGRL data. Then there's a bit more of a translational use case. This group looked at over 77,000 whole genomes of participants with living with rare conditions. And they looked at over 260 or so rare conditions to understand better the causes of those conditions. And they actually found through doing this work that there are genetic causes for 3 rare conditions in particular, that now this understanding has helped to diagnose and treat those conditions in a better way. And this is more a clinical academic use case. So there's this is sort of work that was done quite recently by a group, also Genomics England, in collaboration with researchers in our research network, where they looked at over 33 different cancer types and data from over 13,000 participants living with those cancer types. And they looked at different sort of mutational signatures or different variations within genomes across those cancer types to identify commonalities that might be very important in sort of the clinical care of these types of cancers. So that's quite a recent paper that was just published earlier this year, and all of the links are on these slides so you can access them. And the last one I want to highlight is a very recent diagnostic discovery use case. So here, there's 2 groups actually made a very similar finding, where variations in this gene RNU42, they always have great names, causes a certain or a set of developmental disorders. And this is a very significant finding as it represents one of the most common single genetic causes of such disorders to date. So this information is not just relevant in research setting, but throughout the diagnostic discovery process. This finding was also fed back into the NHS to benefit the care of patients who might have such a variation in their particular condition. And both those papers are now available. And yeah, one published just in May, and the other one actually just this month. And with that, I want to finish just on that slide, which Helen also mentioned, just a few more resources for you to access if you want to learn a bit more. So this page has both links to our blog page on our website. So we quite frequently publish blogs about different topics. We also have a podcast, Behind the Genes, which for the eagle-eyed of you can see that Helen had the most recent one with talking to our CEO, Rich Scott, about working in partnership in the new era of genomic medicine and research. But you also have podcasts which we call Genomics 101, which are sort of shorter explainer podcasts that go into more detail around sort of certain topics in genomics. And then also the link here to the language guide developed by our participant panel, and also the paper that Helen mentioned around sort of research participants being critical friends and agents for change. And with that, thank you very much, and look forward to questions.
Alex, thank you, everybody. I think it's a really nice run through all the work that you do. So now's the time for any questions, things you didn't understand, points you want to raise. Feel free to make them as simple as complex as you want. What are you thinking of them? One thing that struck me, Natalie, when you were talking was around your consent, and you put a slide up that said these are the basic things we would never do. These are things we would do. We want to be involved in. So that you can describe the consent as quite broad, but quite often we hear that things like data protection Act, GDPR, I mean, you've got very, very specific consent. Have you managed to sort of square that problem?
Thanks, Chris. Good question. The technical answer is that consent is not our legal basis under GDPR. So under GDPR, we use legitimate interests as a basis for processing both standard data and special category data for scientific purposes. But we do use consent under common law duty of confidentiality. So it's, as you will probably know, consent is quite a complex landscape in terms of the legal provisions. But our GDPR basis is not consent, and that does mean that we have the capability of having that kind of broader consent model, where there's actually, as I mentioned, we are a research resource, so we're not having to specify in the consent process, your data will be used by these people for these purposes with this intent. The whole idea is that consent is broad because we are using legitimate interest, but it's still incredibly important to make sure that participants are fully informed, and we actually hold ourselves to quite a high standard there to ensure that we're complying with common law duty of confidentiality, because we are taking confidential information, processing it to de-identify, and then of course that de-identify data is what researchers access for all of those broad purposes. So there's a lot underneath all of that, but that's the kind of broad way that we ensure that we can both get, as informed consent as we can, but also allow quite a broad range of purposes for those research users.
Thank you. That's really helpful. You just reminded me why I've never bothered to try and put on a session on consent in 20 minutes, because it would be a nightmare. But maybe that's something we can think about. Francesco, you got your hand back up again. Yep.
I tried to hold off to allow others to put their hands up, but yeah, the question I would ask about de-identifying, no disrespect, I don't know, many of us are here, 14, we look pretty white, but for the diversity of what makes up 19% of the population, regardless of conditions, whether they're invisible or otherwise, looking at support and understanding is, do people look like me? Can they share the same condition? Do they have the same nationality, ethnicity, or race? So what I would ask is, given that you're de-identifying, do you keep information purely on people's ethnicity, so that when you're actually recruiting it, if it works, that it kind of like ensures that, if there's certain, I wouldn't expect a woman to join a prostate cancer group unless they're a carer for somebody that they care for. But I would join a breast cancer if I was affected. 4,000 men do die each year, roughly. So are you able to use some of the data to, maybe look at how the services could ensure it reflects those that are within the population, not just ethnicity, but others? I look at, it's not just, I looked at your picture and it could be that they might be a group of people, your patient participation group, and I counted that, the same, 75% of your public contributors are female, and a quarter male. It's about 50-50. There's ambitions that NHS England have got to actually reflect the ethnicity of the UK, but they've shot themselves in the foot, because in the NHS, 25.1% of all staff make they're non-British employees. So they're talking absolute rubbish, because they've already achieved that. It's happened, but they're looking at all the various agenda for change. Great. So the question, I'll keep it simple, can you use some of that data to, look at your service and make sure no one's left behind? Thank you.
Alex or Anne-Marie, do you want to take that one from the diverse data perspective? I'm happy to jump in if that's
yeah, if it's diverse data, I think Anne-Marie is can speak to it. Otherwise, I can speak to it a bit about sort of the general information on ethnicity that we make available in the research environment alongside other data sets. But go for it, Anne-Marie. You want to talk about the diverse data program?
I suppose so. I think it's probably, yeah, there's probably 2 or 3 different sort of ways of making sure we've answered your question. So if I start with diverse data, so we've got a major 3-year program that we're funded to deliver by the government, which is around building trust and engaging with diverse communities, and then gathering data from people of diverse ancestry, which we're doing through a cohort study approach in order to build the diversity of the data that we have with the NGRL. So I think we're very aware that most genomic data is of people of white European ancestry, and that we really do need to be able to build out that more diverse data set in order that healthcare innovation that happens with genomic data is taking account of the way genomic medicine needs to respond to the healthcare needs of people of all the ancestries. So I think from that perspective, we've got a specific piece of work. We're doing a major program, for example, with people with sickle cell to understand and to kind of develop a set of priorities around sickle cell genomic research. We're partnering with the James Lind Alliance around a priority setting partnership for that, but also to kind of build understanding within the sickle cell community and build that confidence and understanding of genomic data and its possibilities in order to increase the data we hold in the NGRL for people of diverse ancestry. I think your question was also about whether or not we can then make sure that the information I think to Alex's point earlier, if someone is identified with a particular genetic variant, can we then kind of feed that information back into the clinical team supporting them so that they can support the person receive the right diagnosis and better treatment? So yes, I think, although the data is de-identified within the NGRL, we can then, and Alex can say more about how this happens, make sure that if someone is through that diagnostic discovery process that he mentioned, make sure that the clinical team for someone, if we have identified something, if a scientist has identified something new about that person's genomic variant that would help them with their diagnosis or treatment, that can be fed back into the NHS. I don't know, Alex, if you want to say more, or if we need to move on.
Yeah, just very briefly, so ethnicity information is also part of the sort of data sets that researchers would have access to in a de-identified manner within the research environment. So studies are also able to look at these sort of patterns, and yeah, as Anne-Marie said, if there's any findings, feed that back also into the NHS.
Thanks, Alex. We've got 3 hands up. Thank you, Natalie, for answering the question of Jackie in the chat. Very useful. Go to Abby first, Margaret, and then John. Abby.
Okay, so I'm here. So I've got a hair mask on. I don't look my best, which is why I got one. Anyway, so a couple of things really. The first one is some feedback. I love the fish tank analogy. I've been looking through the language guide and it's fantastic. This really does need to be shared, because just as an example, I work in local government and I've actually been referring to a person with a disability, thinking that's more respectful, and they want to be called a disabled person. So that's just so powerful, some of the things in there. Also, just some feedback if this helps. I've always grappled with this. I'm a supporter of us consenting for our data. But for me, I've always pendulum swung between fully identified and pseudonymized. And I actually think it's fantastic that you guys are able to track back. And I think there's a lot of power there, and you must have some advocates within your patient and service user group and wider to actually go out when you do your outreach to encourage people not to opt out, and actually the power of being able to share their data, but for it not to be fully identified, fully de-identified, get my words right. Trying to talk with headphones on because there's builders work outside as well. It's really difficult. This is like a sensory thing. So my question is, and I missed the first session, so you might have answered it there, but most of us in here, you are talking to the converted. We passionately believe in sharing our data and all that. So why are you here? Is there anything particular you want to get out of us while we're here? Thank you.
Under the why are you here a bit from my perspective, because it was a conversation Alex and I had, and it was really because a few of our members had said, can we find out more about the way Genomics and Genomics England work? It was as simple as that. So it was really to give our members an opportunity to listen to what Genomics England do and ask some questions. That was our why we're here.
Thank you. It's fantastic in that case. Yeah, we're learning so much. Thank you.
Can I quickly come in?
Guide. Oh, sorry. Go on. Yeah, go on.
No, I just thinking I wanted to say Abby and Helen might want to come in. And for example, you had a stand at our recent research summit, which Kerry also joined us for. And it was brilliant to build the connection between the participant panel and your members. I know Helen reflected afterwards how great it was to spend time talking to Alison as a community of advocates around the appropriate use of healthcare data. And I think we're really interested in exploring how, again, I'm speaking slightly for Helen, so you might please do come in, Helen, keen to explore those opportunities to collaborate and share knowledge and information and insights as well.
I think there's a lot of value in that. And I mean, I wasn't involved in the decision making around this, but I think there's a lot of genomics needs a lot of demystifying. I mean, I work quite a bit within the cancer community, and there's quite a bit of skepticism, and we don't understand it, and what does it mean? And I went to an event recently with lots of smaller cancer charities, and the understanding of genomics is not brilliant. So I think things like this can really help to improve that, provided we can get this out there to the wider audience. But I will certainly be promoting it. And thank you, Abby, for the shout out for the language guide. I'm really glad to hear that. I mean, that came from, I think, years of us thinking, oh goodness, this is really hard having conversations when people do. And I've learned so much from it as well. I think we might be looking to review that at some stage and add to it. So any comments? But yeah, feel free to share that widely. It's on our website. I think the link's in the chat, isn't it?
It'll be on the slides as well. I've made a note to put it in the weekly newsletter when Elizabeth's back in 2 weeks as well.
Thank you.
Maybe I could ask Margaret and John to ask both their questions. I'm conscious of time, because if we do run out of time, we might be able to come back to them later. Margaret, do you want to go first?
Thank you for the presentation. Really, really interesting. And I know your language guide is really good. A very quick question because of time, but you had very clear what you don't use, allow the data to be used for, and other areas that it is permitted. Does it ever happen that somebody who's willing to give consent but would want limitations within your list of what is used for? And is that possible, or does that rule them out completely?
Thanks. Oh, sorry, John, do you want to ask your question as well?
And So I'm involved in a couple of projects that are about data integration. And I guess I'm particularly interested because it seems to be quite an important subject going forward. I'm interested in, are there any other particular challenges that Genomics England have faced in terms of integrating data, genomic data with other data sets about patients? I could go into a lot more detail, but that's trying to kind of summarize it.
Thank you.
Shall I address the consent question, and Alex, then you might want to address the second one. So thanks, Margaret. It's a great question. The nature of the data that we hold is that it's rich, it's comprehensive, it can be used for multiple things. It's not possible, and the way that we're set up and built, for people to specify, well, I'm happy for data to be used in this way but not that way, or for this purpose and not that purpose, or by this set. We have had people saying, I don't want people from this particular university to access this data because they have a particular challenge with them. It's simply not possible with the architecture we have. It would also create a lot of challenges for the integrity and the accuracy of the data sets that we hold if we started sort of putting conditions on certain bits. It would make it pretty hard to use from a research perspective. So, and part of the ethos of the data set is that it is there as a sort of quite broad resource. So if that's something that someone is not comfortable with, then it may be better for them not to participate. So there's both a kind of a rationale, but also quite an operational reason why we can't be quite granular about the sorts of consent.
Yeah, John, just to get to your question about data linkages and sort of challenges there, I think, well, I'm German by background, and I think we're sort of extremely fortunate in the UK having sort of the NHS and the system that we do that really allows quite extensive sort of linkage of different data sets, particularly for research purposes, and know very well in other countries that's definitely not the case. But that being so, there are still obviously challenges. There's lots of different types of data that might be valuable for research that are held by different organizations or across different research environments potentially. And yeah, really getting that interoperability right and making sure that those data sets can speak to each other in a secure way as well. Yeah, there's always challenges with that. So it'd be really interesting actually if yeah, happy to speak to you offline and learn a bit more about your project as well. Good to give you some more details around the challenge that we face from time to time on
that would be really helpful, Alex. I mean, one project is a research project, the other one is research implications, but it's the pediatric ECMC network are wanting to create a data integration platform, including genomic data, to actually improve the treatment of current and future children and young people with cancer. So that's a very kind of, in a sense, NHS treatment of young people sort of priority from that point. So there's a research element to it, but also very much the treatment of patients.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Yeah, happy to. It would be great to chat a bit more about that.
That'd be helpful. Thank you.
I'll connect the two of you by email when we finished here, if that's okay with the pair of you.
Thank you, Chris. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. And we've hit our 10 o'clock time slot. I told you we'd run out. We always do on these flipping things. I'd just like to say thank you for everybody for another really good session. I think the team at Genomics England have worked really hard on sessions 1 and 2 in trying to make really complicated stuff much more accessible so people like me can understand it. So thank you for all that. Thank you everybody for their attending and their questions. As I said, we'll get this video up as soon as we can. I know the other one, there's a bit of delay on the other ones up, but that's my end, I'm afraid. We'll get those up. We'll try and get the chat, the Q&A in. So any questions that we record in the chat, I'll also send to the Genomics England team if they want to pick any of those up. We'll put those on the link as well when we put the video up. And yeah, thank you. As a reminder, if there are any other topics or suggestions that people want to follow up for an education session or a webinar, such as, if I've given my consent, why is it being ignored? Will be a paraphrase of what John heard. That might be a really interesting one to pick up. So all these things come from you. So feel free to bang me an email, or Elizabeth, or anybody on the Use My Data team that you know. Other than that, I'd just like to say thank you again. Have a really good weekend. Enjoy the almost sunshine, hopefully. Make the best of summer while it's here. Thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you.